University Theater's How to Theater series. This is the first time that we've done this. Our technical crew has done a marvelous job getting this whole thing set up. I wish y'all could see the exceedingly complicated setup we have here. It's amazing, and they did such a wonderful job. So thank you, thank you, thank you guys. So this is our How to Theater series, where our technical staff at University Theater is going to be exploring all about theater technology, all the things that we do backstage to make sure that the play goes on and everything goes smoothly. So today we are going to be going over hand sewing basics. So this is like the super basic stuff that any backstage technician, any actor really should kind of have in their personal toolbox to do backstage quick repairs, to hem a skirt, to put a button back on. And this is also stuff that is really great to use in real life. Here at University Theater, we like to say that we teach both theater skills and life skills. And one of the biggest joys that I get is having a student who graduated 4 or 5 years ago come back and they hold out their shirt and like, look, I sewed on this button. You showed me how to sew on this button. We show you how to sew on buttons and use saws and do all sorts of things. If you want to follow along, you will want to have a little piece of fabric to practice on. You will want to have a needle with which to sew with, and you will want to have some thread. So I'm going to talk a little bit about all of the supplies that we use backstage. So if you haven't gathered these supplies, you can go ahead and gather those and listen to me in the background. All right. So as theater artists, we want to make sure that we are well prepared for any emergency that's going to happen backstage, whether that's a costuming emergency or a prop goes missing or whatever. So most theaters are going to have a backstage sewing kit with which to work with. If you are traveling or if you're working in an alternative space and you don't have this little backstage sewing kit, I really highly recommend that actors and technicians have a little kit for themselves that they carry around with them just in case they need to make those really quick repairs and the supplies that they need are not on site. So I'm going to go through some of the basic supplies that we use that I keep in my personal kit that will get you through most situations. It's not going to be a full extensive kit, but it'll get you through a show. So I'm gonna try. All right, so what we're gonna do is I'm gonna show you on this little dock camera all the things that we want to have in our backstage kit. So the first thing you're gonna want is you're gonna want a pair of scissors. And in the costume shop, we use 2 different types of scissors. We use fabric scissors and we use paper scissors. And the reason we differentiate between the two is because when you use your scissors to cut paper, all those little wood pulp grains in the paper, those are going to put teeny tiny little minuscule nicks in the blades of your scissors. And it's going to make cutting fabric really difficult and really challenging. So you want to make sure that you have a nicer pair of scissors that's going to cut through fabric quickly and easily, and it's not going to leave kind of a jagged edge, or it's not going to snag. And then you have paper scissors to cut your patterns or to do anything that's not fabric, if you have to cut plastic or something like that. So you want to have 2 pairs of scissors and make sure that you differentiate between your fabric scissors and your paper scissors. Here, when we take a pair of fabric scissors and we downgrade it down to a pair of paper scissors, we paint the handles red so we can tell the difference between the 2. So we've got 2 pairs of scissors. Another little useful tool is going to be a pair of snips. And you can get these through a lot of online catalogs. You can also get those at most local fabric stores. And these are just little itty bitty scissors that are going to cut threads, and they're just going to be a little less bulky and take up less space. So for your backstage sewing kit or for your travel sewing kit, these little snips can be really handy. You are going to want to have some sort of a tool to measure things. Sometimes you'll need to adjust a hem. Sometimes you'll need to make alterations kind of on the fly. So there are 2 tools that I keep in my personal sewing kit. One is called a seam gauge, and the other is going to be your standard tape measure. Standard tape measure and both the seam gauge can be found at your local fabric store. Tape measure is flexible, so when you're taking measurements, this is going to wrap around curves really, really nicely and really easily. But sometimes you need something that's a little harder, that's a little more rigid, and this little seam gauge is going to be that tool for you. It has a little lever at the top where you can very quickly and easily mark the length. And I use this a lot for marking hems because you can move the little lever to your hem length, put the little plastic thing there on the bottom, and that's going to get you a nice even hem as you mark around the bottom of your pants or your skirt or whatever you're hemming. So we've got our seam gauge and our flexible tape measure. Awesome. The next tool that you're going to want to have in your kit is going to be obviously a needle. We need needles to sew things together. And there are lots and lots and lots of different types of needles. You're going to want to make sure that you have a variety of needles in your sewing kit to use for a variety of different fabrics. Finer fabrics are going to want a thinner, more delicate needle. Large, bulky fabrics are going to want a thicker needle so that you do not, so you don't break the needle. So the two types of needles that are most commonly used in kind of just your backstage hand sewing things are either going to be your sharps or your crewel needles. The sharps are going to be a little smaller, a little shorter, excuse me, and they also have a smaller eye. I don't know if you can see how teeny tiny the eye of that needle is. So I personally prefer to use the crewel needle, which has a longer eye, which is easier to thread, especially if you're working backstage and you need to thread a needle quickly, or you're in kind of a low light situation. Having a larger eye can be really, really, really helpful. You want to make sure that your needle is sharp. You want to make sure that you're replacing these on a frequent basis. Trying to shove a dull needle through fabric can be really, really frustrating. So you want to make sure that you have lots and lots of needles available to use. And so you can purchase these again at any fabric store. I personally prefer the crewel needles, but some prefer the sharps, and you'll figure out what works best for you and what works best for your hand and your shape, or the size and shape of your hand. Once you have your needle in place, you are going to use thread to sew your fabric together. And there are two different types of thread, or there are lots of different types of thread, but there are two different types of thread that we typically use backstage here at NC State. First type is just your regular standard sewing thread. And this is the stuff that you get of those on those really big displays at Joann's or at other fabric stores. The other type of thread that we use, which is a little harder to find locally, you usually have to order this online, is this waxed, pre-waxed thread. It was originally used for furriers, but now a lot of costume shops do use it for hand sewing purposes because it comes in these pre-cut lengths. And what's great about this is that the thread is pre-waxed, so you don't have to worry about your thread snagging. So let's talk about waxing a little bit. So we have in our sewing kit these little balls or these little discs of wax. And the reason why we want to wax our thread is as you're moving the thread in and out of the fabric, if it's unwaxed, if it's not a slick thread, it's going to catch on that fabric really, really easily. And it's also going to knot up really, really easily. And it can be very frustrating. Again, especially if you're trying to do a very quick backstage repair. So if you do not have access to this furrier thread, you can take your standard sewing thread and cut off a little bit. And then all you want to do is take your little disc of wax, and you can see this is very well loved. It's very well used. It's got lots of ridges in it. And all you're going to want to do is very gently kind of hold it on top of that wax and pull it across, just like that. And what that does is that puts a very, very fine layer of wax on your thread. And you're going to find that it's going to be a lot easier to work with. It's not going to knot up. It's going to be easier to thread your needle, and it's going to go through your fabric a lot more easily. So I highly recommend getting a little piece of wax and just keeping that in your sewing kit. The other big tool that we use quite a bit is our seam ripper, because sometimes you make mistakes. Sometimes you have to take stitches out. Sometimes a button is almost fallen off and you need to just take that off so you can sew it back on. So a seam ripper is a super, super useful tool for all aspects of sewing. This has a pointy end here. That's a nice little sharp point. Has a little bald end here. That's nice and dull. And then on the very inside, on the inside of that little loop, that's a teeny, teeny, tiny little blade. So you can use all three parts of that seam ripper to take out mistakes, to take out a hem that needs to be replaced, to take out any stitches that you need to remove. So a seam ripper is a really, really useful tool. You can get lots of very delicate stitches out very, very easily and not worry too much about ripping your fabric or ripping your project. So you're going to want a seam ripper. There we go. Let's see. The other things that I like to keep in my sewing kit are marking tools. And you can use lots and lots of different things to mark your fabric to make sure that you are doing your alterations correctly or doing your repairs correctly. There are pens that you can purchase that are heat sensitive. When you iron over them, the ink will go away. There are light sensitive pens. Personally, my favorite one is a good old number 2 pencil. I'm a big fan of the number 2 pencil. It gets a really great mark, and as long as it's inside of your project, nobody's going to see it. But two of the more common marking tools that we use are going to be either a little square of chalk or colored wax, or I really enjoy these water-soluble pencils. And you can get these at your local sewing store. You can purchase these online. But what's nice about the pencils is that it's water soluble, so it's going to wash out of most fabrics. You're always going to want to make sure that you do a test run, especially if you're working with a delicate or an expensive fabric. But these, my experience has been that these wash out of most of our fabrics. And what's nice about the pencils is that you can sharpen them so you can get a really fine point. So you can make very, very delicate or very precise markings on your fabric using the pencil. Whereas the chalk, the edges tend to kind of dull down pretty quickly. So these are kind of more of a blunt force marking tool, whereas the pencils tend to be really, really delicate and you can get very, very fine marks on them. So you want a good marking tool. You are also going to want pins. And there are two different types of pins that I typically keep in my personal sewing kit. You're going to want a good old-fashioned safety pin, and you're going to want some standard pins or straight pins. So with the safety pin, they come in lots and lots of different sizes, and these are really, really great to mark hems, to pull in a garment for alterations, and to make really, really quick fixes. I do not recommend that you ever send yourself or an actor on stage wearing a safety pin to hold something together, because these are metal, they are pretty sturdy, but they also run the risk of popping open and accidentally sticking somebody with this very, very sharp edge. So these are really more temporary tools that we can use to mark our alterations and mark where we need to fix things before we make our more permanent fixes. And I'm going to show you some stitches as we work through our time together here today that will help you make really, really quick alterations so you never need to put yourself or another actor on stage wearing a safety pin ever again. So safety first, friends. And then the other type of pin that we use is our standard pin or our straight pin. And these come in a wide variety of types and styles. There are pins for certain types of fabric. There are the pins with the big plastic balls on the front, on the top. There are pins with these teeny tiny little metal heads. A lot of it really comes down to personal preference and the fabric that you're using. If you're using very fine, delicate fabrics, you're going to want to make sure that you're using a finer, more delicate pin. And the one thing that you want to keep in mind is that the pins that have the plastic balls on the top, you cannot iron over those because the plastic will melt onto your project and you will be super, super sad. So you want to make sure that if you're going to be ironing anything that has a standard pin in it, it either has your metal head like this one, or it is a glass-headed pin that is specifically designed for ironing purposes. Those big long pins with the yellow balls on the top or the colored balls, those are typically plastic, so I would not advise ironing over those. So you want to have a variety of straight pins, standard pins in your sewing kit. And I believe that is all the tools that I have here. So using those tools, you can put together a really, really nice little kit to carry around with you and make sure that you have everything that you need to make these backstage repairs. So are there any questions about sewing kits before we move on?
There was a question early on from Claire about what size hand needles you should be using. You talked about your different types of needles.
Yes.
Size important?
Great, yes, size is important. So I'm gonna switch back to our little dot camera here. So using my little examples here, you can see that needles are size. So these are both size 7 needles. So the lower the number of your sized needle, the thicker the gauge wire that the needle is made out of is going to be. So a size 7 needle is a relatively thick needle. I think they go up pretty high. They go up to 15, 16, they go up pretty high. So as you get up into that 10, 12, 13, it's going to get smaller and smaller and smaller. So your size 7, 8 needles are going to be good for most basic fabrics, for your cottons, for your thicker fabrics, for your wools, some thicker linens and that sort of thing. And as you get up to finer fabrics, like your silks and your chiffons, anything that's going to be kind of slick or transparent, you're going to want a finer gauge needle. So you're going to look for your 12s, your 13s, those really, really teeny tiny, very small needles. So thank you for asking that question.
And we have another question. What colors of thread do you recommend for backstage kits?
Oh, great question. I typically keep black, navy, white, ivory, brown, and red. Between all of those, you can typically make most of the repairs that you need that will get you through a show. If you are working wardrobe, or if you have done the costume design, or if you the actor are responsible for your own costume repairs, it can be a good idea to look at the costumes, make sure that if there's any specialty color that you might want to keep in your sewing kit, you can go ahead and throw that in as well. But that range, the black, the navy, the white, the ivory, and the red, and the brown will get you through 85% of your repairs. So those are the colors that I keep in my standard kit. And then if I have anything that is going to be weird, or I know that none of those are really going to work for stage performance, I'll go ahead and throw in, like if you have a baby pink, or if you have kind of a chartreuse or something, I'll throw that in for that particular show. So we are going to go through some super basic hand sewing techniques. The things that we're going to go through, we're going to start like super basic, y'all. We're going to start with threading and knotting a needle. And then we're going to move on how to lock your stitches into the fabric to make sure that your stitches stay secure, because you don't want your costume to fall apart after you send it on stage. We're going to go through the running stitch, the whip stitch, the cross stitch, the back stitch, buttons, and the slip stitch. And if we have time, we'll hit snaps. We'll see what happens. But having that kind of really solid basic techniques are going to get you through most of the repairs that you would need for a backstage purpose. So I'm going to use this fabric here. I am going to grab my needle and a piece of thread. All right, so first things first, we have to thread our needle. So we're going to start. When you're cutting your thread, if you're not using these pre-cut pieces, you're going to want to cut a piece of thread that is about the length from your nose, there's my arm, to the end of your thread. Anything much shorter than that is going to be just frustrating because you're going to have to keep knotting, you're going to have to keep rethreading your needle. Anything longer than that, you really do run the risk of it just knotting up over and over and over again, and you're going to be really frustrated. So that length from about the tip of your nose to the end of your hand is a pretty decently solid length to get you through most projects. All right, so we are going to thread our needle like so. And when we're threading our needle, for most of our hand stitches, we're going to use what we say is a single layer of thread. So we're not going to double up our thread like we will later for buttons. We're just going to use a single layer of thread. So basically what we want to do is have a short tail and then a long tail, which doesn't even fit on the end of my camera here. Short tail and long tail. The short tail is going to go about halfway down the long end of the tail, and then we're going to tie a knot at the end of the long tail. There are lots and lots of different ways that we can tie a knot. Kind of the easiest way for a beginner sewer to learn how to knot is just to do a basic square knot. So you can make a little, there we go, make a little loop. So here's the end of my thread. You can make a little loop with your fingers. If you take that little tail end and flip it through the loop 3 or 4 times, loop, and then you pull on that tail end, that's going to create a knot at the end of your thread. And you can snip off this kind of longer tail end so it's a little shorter, like that. The other way, if you want to be super duper quick fast, is you can take your tail end here, hold it between your first 2 fingers, wrap the thread around your fingers like that, and then you kind of roll it off. You're twisting that thread together, and then you're going to grab onto kind of the top of that little knot and work its way down. And that one came out super, super globby because I'm showing people, so obviously it didn't come out perfectly. So, but that can be a really quick way to do it. Since that's a little globby, I'm just going to trim off a little bit of that there. All right, so we've got our knot and we have our needle. So the first thing we want to do is we want to make sure that our stitches are secured so that they're not going to fall out of our fabric. If you've ever done any sewing on the machine, you know that you need to back tack. You need to run the machine forward a couple of stitches, pause, run the machine backwards a couple of stitches, and then run the machine forward. And that kind of back and forth motion is going to secure the thread into the fabric so that all of your sewing doesn't fall out as you progress. When we're doing hand sewing, we want to do something similar to that. So I typically am going to just do a couple of little stitches here at the very, very beginning of our project. So I have this little piece of fabric that I have folded over and ironed so that it mimics 2 layers of fabric working together. So here, I'm going to come up underneath the bottom of the fold and pull that all the way through. I'm just going to shove that knot under our fold so it stays nice and hidden. So we're coming up here. I'm going to go down through the fabric that is directly next to the fold. like that. So we have a little stitch that's perpendicular to our fold. And then I'm going to come straight up through as close to my original stitch or my original hole as possible. And just give that a nice little tug so that our stitch lays nice and flat against the fabric. And this little perpendicular stitch, you can see I'm pulling on this pretty tightly. That's staying nice and firm. Our stitch is not going anywhere. So by locking our stitch at the beginning of our project and at the end of our project, we make sure that everything stays together. All right, so we've threaded our needle, we've knotted our thread, and we've locked our thread into place. Now we get to actually sew. So when we're sewing, we want to make sure that we're holding our needle. I usually hold it about halfway. Sorry, I'm still learning how this camera works. I hold it about halfway down. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to let the thread rest across my fingers like that. And I'm going to very gently cup that thread. So my second finger here is actually supporting the head of the needle, and my other fingers are holding that thread in place so that the thread is controlled and it's not kind of flying all over the place. We have control over everything that's happening here. We want to make sure that we are holding our needle pretty far up. If you hold it all the way back here where the eye of the needle is, you're not going to have a lot of control. We've got a lot of length here that can be really, really wibbly wobbly. So hold it about halfway up there. And the first stitch we're going to do is called the running stitch. And the running stitch is typically used as a super, super, super fast stitch. If you're doing a lot of hand sewing, that can be used to put two fabrics temporarily together before you sew them really securely, and that's a method called basting. We can also use it super, super fast to do really, really quick repairs. The only thing you want to take into consideration is that the running stitch is not a very strong stitch. So I'm going to show you a quick, strong stitch after we get through with the running stitch. But this can be a really, really quick, fast way to secure two pieces of fabric together, as long as you don't need it to hold too much strength. So what we're going to do is we're going to sew along this fold edge here. I'm going to stay about 1/4 of an inch away from the edge. And the running stitch is basically like when you watched cartoons when you were little and somebody mimed or mimicked sewing, that kind of up and down, up and down, up and down motion. That's what a running stitch is. So what we're going to do is we're going to go down through all of our layers of fabric, and our stitch is going to run parallel to that thread. So we've got one little stitch there. And then we're going to go up through all of those layers of fabric like so. And that's all there is to it. So we're going to go down through all the layers of fabric, and then we are going to go up through all the layers of fabric. And you can see that this stitch is basically creating a single dashed line across our fabric. It's going to join these two pieces of fabric together, but you can see since these stitches are not very close together, they're not on top of each other, it's that single layer of thread. This is not a very secure stitch. So this really is to kind of temporarily put two pieces of fabric together or do a really, really quick repair if absolutely necessary. But the trick with the running stitch is that you want to make sure that your stitches are about the same length at the front and at the back. So I got a little crooked there. That's okay. It's hard to see on the back. But you want to try to keep it nice and even. You want to keep your stitches spaced about the same length, and you want to keep them about the same distance away from the edge of your project or your fold, like that. And then once you're confident with that up and down motion, you can do this little trick where we're actually going to weave the needle in and out of our fabric like that. So we can take that whole series of stitches and do that in one motion like that. And that goes a little faster, but it tends to not be as precise. And it takes a little practice. You still want to keep your stitches about the same length, like so. So that is going to be our basic running stitch. We've got that little dashed line. It should look about the same on the back. And this is just a really, really temporary quick fix for anything that, that might need that super, super fast repair. Once you get to the end, you're going to want to lock your stitch again, because if we just chop this little piece of thread off and just left this hanging here, all of these stitches would very, very quickly fall out. So we want to make sure that we're doing that same locking motion that we did at the beginning of our project down here at the end. So when you get to the end, I'm going to flip it back around here. We're going to go down through the fabric right next to our fold. So we've got that little, oh, that was a little crooked. Let me pretend that was a little perpendicular line. And then we're going to go back up through that very first stitch there. So now our thread is relatively secure. You can see how even if I'm pulling on that lock, that's actually buckling the fabric a little bit. This really is not a very strong stitch. So we have completed our stitches. We've locked our stitch into place. The last thing we need to do is do our knot so that these stitches don't fall out. So I like to do a little French knot at the end of my seams. With a little practice, it goes very, very quickly. So we're just going to take a little stitch right there. We're going to pull it through, but we're not going to pull it all the way through. We're going to hold on to this loop that we've created. We're going to hold on to that with our thumb, and we're going to pull that down until we've got about this much left. We want it to be relatively small, but we want to give ourselves a little bit of extra room so we can finish off the technique. Once you have your little loop in place, you're going to take your needle, you're going to insert it on the inside of the loop. Let's see how, yep, I'm on the inside of the loop. And then using the tension, so you can hold on to your tail end here with your needle hand, create a little bit of tension in that loop. Using that tension, we're going to wrap the loop around our needle 3 times. So that creates a little barber pole on our needle with that loop. Once you have that little barber pole in place, then we're going to pull that needle through. We want to make sure we're holding onto the tension of that loop as we pull. That's going to make sure that our knot doesn't complete too early. So we're going to hold on to that tension, hold on to that tension as long as we can. And once my thumb is basically all the way down the fabric, we're going to drop that loop and very gently pull. And that creates a really, really nice, tidy little knot right there on the side of our fabric. So I'm going to go through that one more time because that tends to be a little confusing sometimes. So we're going to go up through the edge of our fabric. We're going to pull that through and make sure our tail goes all the way through. And we've got this little loop. We're holding the loop with our thumb, taking our needle, putting it on the inside of the loop, wrapping it around 3 times so we get our little barber pole on our needle. There we go. And then we're going to pull that through, hold on to the loop until you get all the way down to the fabric, and then give it a good tug. And we've got a nice, solid, secure knot. The last thing we want to keep in mind when we're doing our knots is that once you've completed your project, once you've completed your knot, if we just snipped our thread right up against the knot, we're not going to have a great time, because what's going to happen is as this project gets worn and as the garment kind of moves around and shifts around on that body, that knot is a little flexible and it's going to shift around a little bit. So if we cut our thread right up against the knot, as the actor or as you wear the project and as that thread kind of moves back and forth within the fabric, that's going to wiggle that knot loose. And if you've snipped your tail right up against that knot's going to come undone and your seam is going to fall apart. So what we want to do is we want to leave a longer tail so that the knot just has a little wiggle room and has a little place to live. We don't want that tail to be on the outside of our project because that's going to look messy. So we're going to do what we call hiding the tail. So if you have two pieces of fabric, we've got our fabric folded up, so it's making pretend that's two pieces of fabric. What we're going to do is we're just going to take our needle, we're going to slip it in between our two layers of fabric. So our needle is, you can't see it from the front, you can't see it from the back. Our needle is in between these two layers of fabric, and then we're just going to go up like that. I usually leave about ½ an inch, that tends to be enough. We're going to push that all the way through so you can see how that tail is now hidden between our two layers of fabric, like so. Now that that tail is hidden, you can kind of give that a little bit of tension and clip it right up against the edge of the fabric. And that will hide that tail in between our two layers of fabric so that our knot has a little bit of wiggle room, but we're not seeing a thread hanging off the edge of our project. So our project looks clean and tidy. So that was threading the needle, knotting it, locking your stitch at the front, doing our running stitch, locking our stitch at the back, knotting and hiding the tail. So that's a lot, but the same technique kind of at the beginning and at the end is going to work for almost all of your projects. All right.
Nicole Heeman said, if there is time, could we see how fast you can do the fast stitches? So that's standing out there, just
All
if
right.
we're able to.
Call me out there, Nicole. I see you. I see you. Okay. Well, we'll see if we can time. I'll see if I can leave some time at the end to time me. Okay. All right. So that is our running stitch. The next stitch we're going to do is called the back stitch. And so the back stitch is a similar stitch technique, but this is going to be something that is going to be a lot stronger and be a lot more sturdy than our running stitch. So basically this stitch is going to double back on itself and it's going to create a solid line going across the front and across the back. And so this tends to be the stitch that I use most often if I have to do a super fast, sturdy repair when I'm working backstage. If a, God forbid, if a zipper pops or if you know, something splits and you need to sew it up super fast, this will get you through the show until you can take the garment, bring it upstairs, and make a more permanent repair. There was a show that we did a number of years ago where literally I was standing in the lobby waiting to go and see the show on opening night and get a frantic phone call from downstairs, and an actor had gotten into their dress for the opening number and the zipper fell out, the zipper broke. So I had to run downstairs and I used my back stitch and literally sewed this actor into her dress like 30 seconds before she went on stage. You know, pushed her out on stage, she did the whole opening number, and when she got off stage we had to use our seam ripper to get her out of her dress. And then we made the repair overnight and she was fine for the rest of the run. But this is a really easy, fast stitch that we can use to make those repairs and make sure that our actors are going to be secure and sturdy as they go out on stage. So I have threaded my needle. You can either use a single layer of thread for a back stitch or you can use a double layer of thread. You could tie your two threads together like this so it's even stronger and sturdier. I'm going to go ahead and do a single layer just for demonstration purposes. We're going to lock our stitch into place here. Make sure our knot is hidden underneath. We're going to go back down and we're going to go back up. So that is the same locking technique that we used on our running stitch. So for this one, instead of holding my fabric like this, I'm going to hold my fabric so that the edge of the fabric is facing me, and I'm going to work my stitches from left to right. So what we're going to do is we're going to take our first stitch, very, very similar to how we took our first stitch for the running stitch. So we're going to go all the way down through all the layers of fabric. And now what I'm going to do is from the back, instead of coming up to the right of that, as I would with the running stitch, instead I'm going to come back, here we go. I am going to come back to the center of that stitch. So I'm actually coming up through all 3 layers of fabric like this, and I'm coming up through the center of that stitch like that. And now I'm going to go back, I'm going to go forward another full stitch length. So basically, the way that the stitch works is that we're going to go forward a full stitch length, and then we're going to go back and we're going to meet the end of the preceding stitch at that half stitch length, like that. And this creates this really, really strong series of stitches, because basically we're doing this little double stitch and we're backing up on ourselves so that this has a lot of strength and it has a lot of sturdiness to it. This acts very, very similar to the interlocking stitch that you have on a sewing machine, but it's doing it by hand. So we're going to go, up. So we're going to back your half stitch, forward a full stitch. And once you have that rhythm in place, just like with the running stitch where we did our little weaving in and out, you can do that same technique with the back stitch. So this is that super fast stitch that Nicole was challenging me to do. So here we can go forward, we can meet the end of that first stitch, or the end of that preceding stitch, pull that through, oops, like that. So we've got forward a full length, meet the end of the preceding stitch, and pull that through. And you can see, once you kind of get into your rhythm, it goes relatively quickly. This is not going relatively quickly because I'm trying to demonstrate, but you get the gist. And so when you complete your running stitch, or I'm sorry, when you complete your back stitch, you should have a solid line of stitching on the front, and you should have an almost solid line of stitching on the back. That is not terribly tidy, but this is a really, really strong stitch that is going to get you through most of your backstage repairs, like so. So that is our back stitch. And you can see I'm giving that a lot. I am pulling. I'm not very strong right now because the gyms are all closed, but I am pulling really, really, really hard on this, and that is not going anywhere. Whereas if I did that with my running stitch, that's going to open right up. So back stitch is really my good, solid, go-to, super fast backstage repair stitch. I really love using this one for those repairs when you need to fix something in 30 seconds and shove an actor back out on stage. And then when you finish your back stitch, you're going to lock your stitch and knot off just like you did with the running stitch. Cool. So the next stitch that we're going to use is, the next stitch we're going to demonstrate is called the whip stitch. Whip stitch, W-H-I-P stitch. And I use this stitch a lot. This stitch is super useful for tacking down things onto garments if you are applying any sort of trim if you're applying lace to a garment. It can be a really handy stitch for hemming purposes. And it's just a really great all-purpose stitch. I use this stitch in a lot of different applications. So we're going to start off the same way that we did for our previous 2 stitches. We're going to hide our little knot. We're going to go down and we're going to go up like that. All right, so the trick with the whip stitch, especially if we're using this for hemming purposes, we're going to make pretend that this side of our fabric is the inside of our project, and this side of our fabric is the outside of our project. And we want to make sure that our stitches on the inside are nice and tidy, and the stitches on the outside are almost invisible. And so the way that we do that is we are going to take our needle. I'm going to have to take off my glasses for this one. No, that's not going to work. We're going to take our needle and we are going to pick up a single thread. You can barely see that single thread right next to our fold. And then in the same motion, we are going to pick up the edge of the fold there. And you can see our needle is running perpendicular to our fold line there. And we're going to pull that through all in one motion like that. And that's going to create these little diagonal stitches going across our project like that. There we go. So we're just picking up a single or 2 threads of our fabric, and then we're going up through the edge of that fold. And so the trick with the whip stitch is to try to keep your stitches as evenly spaced as possible. I tend to use about a quarter inch, maybe as long as a 1/3 of an inch. Anything much longer than that, if you get up to like 1/2 inch, your stitches are not going to be very sturdy, and you will find that you'll have to redo them. So we want to just pick that up. And if we are just picking up that single thread there on our outside fabric and then going up through the edge of our fold, that's going to create these very, very nice, tidy little diagonal stitches there. And if we flip our project over, we can see we've just got these bare little pinpricks of the black up against this orange fabric. And so you can imagine if we had done this in a thread that either matched or was even similar to our fabric, those would blend right in with our fabric. And from stage distance especially, you're not going to see those teeny tiny little pinprick stitches. So somebody had asked earlier about the colors of thread that I like to keep in my sewing kit. Just having those 5 or 6 basic colors, that's going to get you something that's going to be close enough to your fabric that, again, from stage, nobody's going to see that if I had used a brown thread on this orange fabric, that's going to blend right in. So it's, having matching thread is always preferable, but if you are kind of in a pinch, those 5 or 6 colors are going to get you through. So that is our whip stitch. All right, I am going to see if I can fit in 2 more techniques. I'm going to show you the cross stitch and how to do buttons. So the cross stitch is going to work similar to the whip stitch in that we want to make sure that our stitches on the back side are really small and fairly invisible, and the stitches on the front are going to be nice and evenly spaced. So we're going to, oops, I knotted that really poorly. There we go. All right, so we're gonna lock our stitches in place. So the cross stitch is a really solid but flexible stitch. I tend to use a cross stitch a lot for hems, and if I'm applying any trim that needs to go around a curve, a cross stitch is going to be really flexible and it's going to help us go around those curves. It's a really great stitch if you're hemming skirts and if you're hemming pants. It has a lot of movement, but it's still strong and sturdy. It has a little bit of flexibility, and it allows the fabric to hang really, really gently, but it's not kind of going anywhere. So with the cross stitch, what we're going to do is we're going to turn our fabric so that the fold is facing us. And when we make our stitches, our needle is going to go from right to left, but our stitches are going to work themselves from left to right. And what we're going to do is we're going to create a little series of mountains and valleys as we're going across our fabric here. So we're going to take a little stitch. We're not going to go through all of our layers of fabric. We just want to go through the top layer. We're going to go from right to left, like that. You can see how the head of my needle is here, the pointy end is there, and we're going to pull that through. And now you can see how that thread crosses over itself, hence the name cross stitch. You want to make sure that your thread is kind of off to the side here. You don't want to execute the second half of the stitch with the thread in this direction because it's not going to create the cross when you go back up. So we are crossed up here. And now we're going to do that same movement going from right to left, right up against our fold, just picking up a couple of threads of our bottom fabric there. And we're going to go right to left, pull that through, and you can see how when we go back up, this is going to create a little cross, like so. And so what I really love about this stitch for hemming purposes is that because we have the thread crossing on top of each other, that's adding a little bit of extra strength to our hem, so it's less likely to fall out. And then this also creates a little bit of flexibility. You can use the whip stitch to hem things, but it tends to hold that fabric really, really tightly against itself, whereas the cross stitch is a little more flexible and it will allow your fabric to float on top of itself, which just tends to give you a little more graceful hem. Plus, it is honestly just like super, super satisfying to complete the stitch. It looks really, really pretty, and it makes the inside of your garment look very clean and very professional if all of your little mountains are about the same height and are spaced about the same distance across from each other. So you can see here, we've got a little bit of flexibility, but that's pretty strong. And if we flip our fabric, again, we just have those teeny tiny little pinpricks where if this was a matching orange thread, those little pinpricks would blend right in and we wouldn't even see them. So that is the cross stitch. So the trick with the cross stitch that you just want to make sure that you are doing is that right to left action with your needle as your stitches are working across the fabric from left to right. And that is creating that cross action, oops, on our project here, like so. I mean, honestly, y'all, this legit is one of my favorite stitches to use. I use this in a lot of personal projects as well as work projects. It's just super satisfying. And that really would blend right in. So we've got our cross stitch. All right, so we have done our whip stitch, our running stitch, our back stitch, and our cross stitch. All right, since we have a little bit of extra time, I'm going to go over what's called the slip stitch, S-L-I-P, stitch. So for this stitch, again, we're going to thread our needle with a single layer of thread. We're going to knot at the end. And so the slip stitch is used to, I use it a lot to apply things onto projects. If you're hand applying trim or lace, the slip stitch is a really great way to sew fabric directly on top of each other while keeping your stitches completely hidden. So we are going to lock our thread into place, hide our little knot. Oh, sorry, y'all. There we go. All right, so from here, what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to insert my needle into this fold. So you can see how this is folded over here. I'm going to very carefully insert my needle into this fold, go forward about 1/4 of an inch, and have the needle come up out from the top of that fold like that. So the bulk of the thread is actually traveling across our project internally on the inside of that fold. And here I'm going to take a little pinprick stitch like that. And then repeat that action. So we're going to, oops, it's hard to do with my glasses on. Okay, we're going to travel, and then we're going to go take our little pinprick stitch and pull through. Travel. Pinprick. So you can see we've got little pinprick stitches on this side. We've got little pinprick stitches on this side, and all of our traveling thread is hidden in between our layers of fabric here. So this can be a really, really useful stitch if you're using very fine or very delicate fabrics, if you're applying trim onto something where you want to make sure that your stitches are as hidden as possible, and the whip stitch would just be too bulky or it would be too visible. This is a really fantastic stitch to keep everything hidden like that. So that is going to be our running stitch. All right, so we've got our, running stitch. We have our back stitch. So it's going to be our super sturdy one. We have our whip stitch. Those are our little diagonal stitches there. We have our cross stitch. That's going to be my favorite hemming stitch. I really love that one. And we have our slip stitch. That's going to be about as invisible as you can get. We've got running stitch, back stitch, whip stitch, cross stitch, and your slip stitch. All right. So next, we're going to move on to buttons. This is the thing that people tend to get most excited about because it's something that we all have to deal with mostly on a daily basis. Usually everybody has to repair a button at some point in their lives. So we're going to use our fabric here. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to mark where I want my button to go. So I'm going to use my pencil here, and I'm going to put my button onto that dot. When we're applying buttons onto a project, we're going to want to make sure that they line up with our buttonholes appropriately. So we're going to pre-mark where our buttons go on our project. But since we don't have a buttonhole here, I'm just going to put that dot there for us to reference. When we're working with buttons, you're going to run across two basic types of buttons. We have our standard button. This is going to be, if you told somebody to draw a button in Pictionary, this is probably what they would draw. It's a little circle. They usually have 2 or 4 holes, and it's flat on both sides. So we have our standard button. The other type of button that we have is called a shanked button. That's S-H-A-N-K, shanked button. And so our shanked button is going to look just like our standard button on the front, but it doesn't have any holes through it. So if we look on the back, it has this little metal loop on the back of the button, and that is our shank. And so what that little metal loop does is that helps the button stand up away from our fabric. So when we apply that button to our fabric, the button is actually going, I can't show this very well, the button is going to stand away from our fabric like that. And the reason why we want our button to stand away from the fabric is if we sewed our standard button flush up against the fabric, when you go to button your buttonhole, that doesn't have any place to go. There's no space in between our button and our fabric for that extra layer of your buttonhole fabric to go through. So a pre-shanked button is going to stand up nice and firm against that fabric. You see the shanked buttons a lot on like heavy winter coats, on your jeans. Most of our jean buttons are going to have some sort of a shank on the back of them. And if your button has a decorative element like this one where we want to see a complete design as opposed to seeing holes with thread through them, you're going to see a lot of shanked buttons with a really pretty design on them. So the shanked buttons are pretty easy. You're going to use your whip stitch and you're just kind of going to go through the bottom of the fabric, through your shank, and then back through. The more complicated button to sew on is actually what we think of as our standard button, our Pictionary button, because this doesn't have that shank on the back of it. So if we just kind of sewed that down, our buttonhole wouldn't have any place to go. So what we're going to do is we're going to use our thread to create that shank for us. So what we're going to want to do is we are going to double up our thread. So up until now, we have been doing a single layer of thread with a short tail and a long tail and a knot at the end of our long tail. Now, what we're going to do is we're going to take, so I've threaded my needle, so I've got my needle threaded here. We're going to take both ends of our thread and we're going to hold them together so that we're going to treat them like one. So we're going to hold those two ends at exactly the same length, and then we're going to tie our knot using both threads and just treat them like one. So I'm going to do a little square knot here. Like so. So we've got that little knot with our thread doubled up. And the reason why we like to double up our thread for buttons and for closures in general is just they take a lot of stress. If you think about when you put on your jeans or you put on a button-down shirt, just the action of moving that button in and out of the buttonhole is going to put a lot of stress onto that thread that's holding the button on there. So, and then especially in theater, if we're doing things like quick changes, or even if an actor is not necessarily in a quick change, they just need to get in and out of costumes very quickly, they're going to be pulling on those buttons a little harder than we would just getting dressed in the morning, just because they're running out of time, they're feeling a little frantic, or they just need to execute that change really quickly. So we want to make sure that when we put our buttons on for our actors, that they stay on really, really sturdy. We don't want to have to worry about them popping up mid-performance. We don't want to worry about our wardrobe crew having to constantly repair buttons. So we're going to put this button on really, really, really sturdy so that it's not going to fall off of our actor's costume. So the first thing we want to do is we want to create a base for our button to attach to. So we could theoretically just kind of sew our button on just like this, and it would probably be fine, but we're going to give it a little bit of extra insurance. So I have knotted my thread here, and instead of just coming up through my fabric and starting to sew my button, I'm going to do a little cross, a little X on top of that dot just to make sure that my thread has a little bit of extra security, a little bit of extra strength, and a little bit of extra stability. So I'm just going to do a little X on top of my dot, like so. And that really secures my thread into my fabric. And now I can start my button. So I'm going to come up through the center of that X, like so. So from here, we want to make sure that the center of our button is centered directly on the center of our little mark, on the center of our X. So we've got a lot of layers to work with here. It can take a little bit of a finger yoga to get used to doing this, but we're going to loosely hold our button on top of that dot. We want to make sure that our center is directly on top of our dot. And so now we've got our fabric, we've got our thread in between, and we've got our button on top. So we're going to hold that pretty loosely. I sometimes will angle it up just a scooch so we can get under there. And you're going to go up through one of your holes. Again, we're going to double check, make sure that our button is centered. And then we're going to go down through the hole next to it. And we're going to go all the way through. And we're going to pull it so that it is all the way through, but we don't want to pull it really, really tightly. We're actually sewing this on relatively loosely because what we're going to do is we're going to use this thread to create our shank for our button so it stands up away from our fabric, just a scooch. So now we're going to go back up through that first hole, and this can be kind of tricky, and back down through that second hole. And we're going to do that motion for a total of 6 times. And that just leaves our button super, super secure. Make sure our button is staying on really, really well so that it doesn't fall off. I'm not going to do all 6 because we don't actually need this button to work, but you can see that we want that to stay on nice and securely. Once we've gone up and down through our first series of holes 6 times, we're going to pause so our thread and our needle are on the back of the project, and then we're going to shift over and we're going to do that same thing on the second set of holes. So we're going to go up and down, and you can see I've got a little bit of looseness here. And that's okay, that's exactly what we want. All right, so once you've gone through your 2 series of holes, we've gone up and down 6 times, you're going to want to end again with your thread and your needle on the back side of our project, like so. And now what we need to do is we need to move our thread and our needle in between our button and our fabric. So you can see I've got this little kind of glob of thread underneath my button, in between my button and my fabric. So if we had kind of left this just as it is, that little glob of thread is not very secure. This button does not feel very secure because we still need to create our shank. So if we just knot it off now, I mean, it would be not great. The button would stay on, but it wouldn't be sturdy, and our button really wouldn't have the strength and stability that it needs to very, very firmly stand up away from our fabric. So what we're going to do to create our shank is we are going to take our needle and thread, and we are going to kind of push the button to the side, and we're going to come up between. You can see the needle is right there. So we're going to come up in between our fabric and our button and pull that all the way through. So now we're kind of back where we started. Our thread is in between our button and our fabric, And now we've got this glob of thread underneath our button that we need to deal with. So we're going to do what's called wrapping the shank. So we're going to take our working thread. We're just going to let our needle hang to the side for now. We're just going to take this thread and we are going to wrap it around that little glob of thread. And we're going to pull that pretty hard. We want our shank to be nice and solid. I usually go around 5 or 6 times and give that a really, really solid pull. I usually hold onto the button to give it a little bit of tension so you're not pulling on the fabric. We just want to pull on that thread to make sure that that shank is nice and tight. And now if we look at our little glob of thread underneath our button, it is wrapped, it is tidy, it's not going to catch on anything as the actor or as you use the button, and our button is standing up away from our fabric just a scooch. It really doesn't need to be that tall. It depends on the fabric that you're using, but if we're looking at short weight sort of fabric like this, it really does not need to be very tall. You just want it standing away from that fabric just a little so your buttonhole has someplace to go. So now that we have completed our button, or now that we've completed our shank, we can go back down to the back of the project, flip our project over, and now we can do our knot. So I'm just going to grab a little stitch of the fabric here to secure my knot. And we're going to knot off the same way that we did for our other stitches. So I've created this loop. I'm going to pull so that we've got our loop. We've got a little tension here. I'm going to take my needle, wrap it around the loop from the inside. So we've got a little barber pole. Pull that through. Hold on to the loop with your thumb. That's going to create the tension it needs for the knot to work its way down. And then pull your knot tight. And the last thing you want to do is you want to make sure that we're hiding this tail in between our layers of fabric. So typically when we sew on buttons, you're generally not going to be sewing on one layer of fabric. That's just not going to be sturdy enough. So there's going to be a couple of layers here, and we're just going to take a stitch in between our layers. And you want to leave a relatively decent tail in between those layers of fabric, like that. And then snip off your thread. And again, the reason why we're leaving that tail on the inside of the fabric, I left probably about 1/2 to 3/4 of an inch there, is because this button is going to take a lot of stress. It's going to get a lot of wear, and that knot is going to wiggle. It's going to take a lot of tension. And so if we cut that tail right up against the knot, the button is eventually going to fall loose. It's going to come off, and somebody's going to be super sad. So we want to make sure that our knot is nice and sturdy and that our tail is hidden so that our button stays on. So that is buttons, and that may be the most useful thing that I teach. All right, the last thing I'm going to do is snaps, and let me go grab a snap. 2 seconds.
Laura, while you're grabbing snaps, we've got 2 button questions. Well, 1 button question and 1 general question. Do you ever cross the thread between the buttonholes? So do a crisscross rather than straight up and down?
That is an excellent question. Hi. Personally, I don't. I was taught that the kind of the equal sign is a little stronger and a little sturdier than the X. I haven't really tested it out, but my personal habit is to do the little equal sign as opposed to the X. I was told that it's sturdier, but I have no scientific evidence one way or the other. All right, so the last thing that we're going to go through today are snaps. So snaps are another closure tool that we use. Buttons are some of the most common ones, but snaps can be really useful, especially in theater, for things like quick changes. So if an actor has to get in and out of a costume really, really fast, the snaps can help that go a little quicker so that they can get on stage and do what they need to do. Snaps are going to come in two different sections. So we have a section, a divoted section, and a prong section. So the divoted section is going to be this one here. It's going to have a curved top, and if you flip it over, it's going to look surprisingly like the pronged section, but it's just a little curvier. And what you can see, if you can try to see if I can get the angle. Yeah. So if you look on the inside here, there's these little springs, these little kind of curly-Q springs on the inside there. This part is going to go face down onto your project. The prong section is much flatter. So we can look at the top. It's going to have this little prong that's going to go into the divot. And then when you flip it over, it is completely flat on the back, and it does not have those little curly-Q springs like we have in the divot section. So kind of the big mistake that people tend to make with snaps is they will reverse the divot side of the snap, thinking that it is actually the prong side of the snap. So you want to make sure that your prong has that flat back, and your divot is just going to be a little curvier, and it's going to have those springs on the back. So when we're snapping things, we've got our little fold here, like so. We're going to put the prong side of the snap on the inside of the fold, like that. So it's going to snap into place. And typically when I place snaps, I'm going to place them onto the project so that they snap down into the project. So if we're doing a shirt, we do it on the side of the shirt that kind of presses into the body. That way you're using kind of that blunt force against the body to find that divot so that the prong has a place to go. You can do it the opposite way, but I find that it's easier for the actor if the prong is on top of that project. And so what we're going to do is we're going to thread our needle again. Oh, here we go. And with snaps, just like buttons, we're going to double up our thread. Oops. All right, so we're going to double up our thread. We're going to hold our two ends together, treat them like one, create our knot. So the same thing with our snap, or with our button. We're typically going to mark where the center of our snap goes. I've got my prong side here, so we're going to open that up, and we're going to put the center of the snap right on that dot. And then, oops, there we go. We're going to do our little X, just like we did for our button. There we go. Helps if I hold the fabric where you can see it. So we're going to do our little X, and that's again just going to give our snap a little more stability and a little more strength, especially with snaps where people will tend to pull on them to release them. We want to have a little bit of extra stability. So we've done our X. We've come up through the center of our X. Our thread is really strong and stable. And now what we're going to do is we're going to put our snap directly on top of that with the center of the snap right there. So we've got a little sandwich. We've got our fabric. We've got our thread in between. And then we have our snap on top. So all we're going to do is we're going to go down through the eyelet, and then we're going to go back up through, or back up right next to the snap on the outside of the snap. So we're going outside, inside. So we're just going to do this little stitch right around that eyelet. And again, like with the buttons, I tend to do 6 passes on each eyelet. You can do more, but I would not advise doing less. Snaps really do take a lot of use, especially in theater. So once you've done your 6, now we're going to travel to our next eyelet. We don't want to travel on top of the snap. So if I went here and just kind of went like that, this thread is going to live on top of the snap. And that's something that could catch really easily. And we don't want to run the risk of accidentally breaking the thread as the actor uses it. So what we're going to do is we're going to travel underneath the snap, come up in between the snap and the eyelet like that. And now we can do our 6 passes again, like so. So we are going to work our way all the way around all 4 eyelets using that same basic principle. We're going to travel our thread under the snap. We're going to go through the eyelets at least 6 times so that our snap stays really, really sturdy. And so since we're running low on time, we're going to pretend that I went all the way around the snap. And so to knot off, what we're going to do is we're going to go up through. So our thread is on the front of our project, right up next to these little stitches that we just completed. And what I like to do is go ahead and slip my needle in between those stitches like that. And then I can pull through, create my loop, and then do my knot like so. And then I can hide the thread underneath the snap. So I can take that little tail, move my needle in between the snap and the fabric, come out the other side, and that's going to hide that tail right underneath that snap so we don't have any sort of trailing threads around like that. So let's pretend that I went all the way around, so this is sewn on all 4 times. To mark where the divot side of the snap needs to go, this is a really great trick. I love this trick, y'all. So we sew on all of our prong sides of the snaps. We're going to open it up, and we're going to use that chalk that I talked about like an hour ago. So we're going to use this chalk, and we're going to color right on top of that prong. We're going to give that a nice solid little layer of chalk right there. And then if we allow the project to fold down where we want it to be and just give that a nice little nudge and then open it back up, that marks where the other side of our snap goes. And so if we put that right there, that's going to enter it and snap closed really, really solidly. And we're not going to have any buckling. If our snap is placed incorrectly, your project is going to look a little wavy. It's going to look wrinkly because the fabric is not going to be flush up against itself. So you want to make sure that your snap sides are placed appropriately. So I love that little coloring trick with the chalk.
Elizabeth had a question. Would you ever use multiple types of stitches in a single project?
Absolutely, absolutely. Most projects are going to have a variety of different stitches in them. If you were completely hand sewing a project, you would use a variety of stitches to put the project together, and then different stitches, either that whip stitch or the cross stitch for your hemming. On machined projects, on projects that we do in the costume shop, we may use a cross stitch for the hem. We may use a whip stitch to put on trim or to apply trim. We're going to use that stitch to do buttons and snaps. So yeah, it really is looking at the specific thing that you're doing for that particular, so the hem may need something different. So yes, the answer is yes. I want to thank y'all so much for joining us on this very, 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 very first How to Theater. If you have any follow-up questions, my contact information is on the NC State University Theater's website. Feel free to email me anytime. I'm happy to answer any questions.